In a previous video, I had admitted to having a bit of a bias against modern indie horror games touting the survival horror label. The reason being, I had been burned in the past by titles that couldn't be further from the genre being sold to me as similar to my beloved Resident Evil. And initially, I was planning on showing you guys a few examples of what I'm talking about, but instead, I thought maybe we could just Google the term modern survival horror. So I did just that, and the results were pretty much exactly what I had expected. Not even a third of these titles could be considered part of the genre, even by the most liberal definition of the term. So as you can imagine, I'm a little apprehensive when people start throwing that word around. And it only took about 5 total minutes of gameplay from Tormented Souls for me to see the error of my ways. I had misjudged and subsequently missed out on a lot of potentially awesome new games that held true to the gameplay traits not only important to me, but the survival horror genre. So in the redemption arc of the century, I've been on a bit of a crusade to remedy this little problem, and in asking around for recommendations, the name Alisa has come up quite a lot. So I started looking into it, and I'll tell you this right off the bat. Making your game not only play like an old PS1 title, but look like one too? Well, consider me interested. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews.
Alright, listen up. Tonight, a spy stole important blueprints, and he got away.
Alisa is a very interesting little beast. First off, it already found itself in my sights just by adopting that early PS1 low poly look I love so much. And if I'm being totally honest, that's enough to warrant a playthrough alone in my opinion. But the cherry on top is the fact that the developer is also targeting that old survival horror gameplay style as well. Fixed perspective, pre-rendered environments, tank controls, and exploration centered around the concept of backtracking, all the little elements I've been craving in a modern release. So I tried digging a little deeper into this project to see if I could find anything out about its development, but there's not a lot of info out there, or at least not a lot that I can find. It seems like someone named Casper Crows did most of the work on this thing, and I really mean most of the work. From sound effects and level design to animations and general graphics work, this guy was a very busy beaver. Now, there were others involved in the project, so it wasn't exactly a one-man show, but I only found this out after I'd beaten the game, and without spoiling the gameplay section of the video, let's just say I assumed a much bigger staff was working on this thing. But since I wasn't able to find out much more than that, what do you say we jump into this game's story and find out if it's as true to PS1 era survival horror as it claims to be?
Everyone becomes mad here.
I'm gonna warn you ahead of time, this is going to be the first of what might be 1 million back-to-back comparisons with old PS1 games, but Alisa to me feels like it got a lot of its inspiration from titles like Silent Hill when it came time to tell its story. Things start off pretty straightforward, but it doesn't take more than say 10 minutes of gameplay till all that ends. The general setup has you taking control of Alisa, a royal agent for the Emperor of... Now that I think about it, I don't think that's really been addressed in the game. He's always just referred to as the Emperor. Well, anyways, Alisa's part of a military task force put together to find a thief who's gotten away with government secrets. The idea is to send 2 soldiers to every stop on the train line, and eventually one of the group should be able to dig up some info. Your partner is this dashing set of geometric shapes who confuses chewing on toothpicks with having a personality. Once the 2 of you start canvassing your stop, it's not long till you come across an old man that points you in the direction of the last place this thief was seen. You eventually come across the enemy of the state, and in pursuit, your partner swallows his toothpick.
Jen, what are you doing?
I swallowed my cure-dent.
Making your way towards the target, you get jumped by these gross-looking caterpillar things and wake up in this really creepy mansion that looks eerily similar to a life-size dollhouse. And from this point, you'll have to wait a good long while till you get any other straightforward story beats. Throughout your playthrough, you will definitely be coming across journal entries and files giving you a bit of a vague picture of what's going on here, but to be totally honest with you guys, I was not able to put the full picture together using this stuff alone. I feel like I saw maybe 90% of the supplemental story files, but it never really felt like I was getting close to really unraveling things. There are a few that talk about patience and an object that's corrupting them, but then there's some details concerning a mine and its workers. I don't know, I really was not able to put all this together. Now, maybe there are a few connective pieces that I just didn't come across that would complete everything, but I don't really think that's the case. Even in the last 2 cutscenes of the game, there's new information being delivered that shines a light on the Emperor not quite being the benevolent ruler Alisa once thought, but there's no resolution for all this stuff. They hint at evidence existing that would justify the thief from the start of the game stealing those blueprints, but without ruining the end cutscene, I'll just say don't expect to figure out what that evidence is or what the blueprints were. Now, it's definitely possible that I missed some kind of condition that would have gotten me a better ending, but it's a little hard digging up info on this game right now. The only thorough walkthrough I could find still has unresolved details they weren't able to figure out. Really though, this isn't the complaint it sounds like. It's actually kind of cool not having every single detail about a game at my fingertips. Sort of reminds me of the old 16-bit days when most of what you knew about a game came from word of mouth and there was no guarantee any of it was actually true. I don't know, I kinda like that. All that being said though, I wouldn't expect a lot of content as far as story is concerned in this game. Essentially, you'll have the beginning cutscene, the ending one, and maybe 2 total story-based ones during the actual game. You never really get any resolution to a lot of the questions you're definitely going to have throughout the game, like, what the hell is this twisted dollhouse? Who is this doll and why is she helping me? Also, who the hell is this? How did the thief gain superpowers, and what's the connection between this place and our commanding officer? Now, to be totally clear, it's not the worst thing in the world to have unanswered questions. I mean, the comparisons to something like Silent Hill are going to be unavoidable, but I think there's a key difference between the two. While a casual playthrough of the first Silent Hill game will also leave you with some unresolved plot points, 1, it doesn't introduce the most important one in the last 5 minutes, and 2, there are actual answers to those questions if you're willing to put in the time and work. Nearly every single loose end you might have found gets tied up by the time you watch Silent Hill's credits. It just requires you to search every room, read every file, and visit a few out-of-the-way locations. With Alisa, while I can't really confirm this, it just sort of feels like there aren't any more answers to be found. And if that ends up being the case, I think it's sort of lame to purposely stage a late-game twist you never really intended on resolving. That being said, there is a chance this is setting up for a sequel, which might actually be pretty cool, and of course there's always the chance that I'm just wrong and missed some key part of the story. Just off the top of my head, I can remember never finding out what item I have to use to open this gate, so maybe there's a lot I'm missing out on. But even considering that complaint, if it ends up being legitimate, I've gotta say this was an awesome little story. For me, and I know this may be different for a lot of you guys, but the stories in these games have just been a driving force that makes me want to get from one side of the map to the other. I mean, sure, it's awesome when they're truly great, like in RE2 or Silent Hill 3, but at the end of the day, I just want a simple mystery to keep me progressing. A carrot on a stick to ensure I stay interested when I inevitably get stuck on a puzzle. And in those terms, Alisa gets a passing grade. Like I said, I would have preferred a little more content and a few less unresolved twists, but it most definitely served its purpose. The thought of finding out just what this place is and why it exists drove a good portion of the experience for me, and I think if you enjoyed this genre, you'll also get the same effect. Just know what you're getting into beforehand, which is a story that's not afraid to say too little but will still serve its role in keeping your gaze fixed on getting to the end. When I first heard about Alisa, I had sort of assumed how it was going to play for me. I figured it'd be similar to one of my favorite games released in the last few years, Tormented Souls, but after a conversation with Under the Mayo, great channel by the way, he clued me into this being a little more than just some RE clone. And to his credit, he was absolutely correct. Alisa is a lot deeper than its visuals would lead you to believe, but before we dive too far down, let's cover the easy stuff first. Alisa is a classic survival horror game. It's not inspired by the genre or an evolution of it in some way, but instead a perfect representative. Meaning I have yet another recently released game I can point to when people tell me that style just doesn't work anymore. Being a survival horror game, you can expect all the typical trimmings. You'll be exploring a big mansion-type environment until you procedurally unlock more and more of the place via puzzle solving, key hunting, and the age-old practice of repeatedly hitting the examine key on everything in the background that looks even remotely interactable. Movement's handled with your typical tank control setup, and since it's kind of hard to mess this style up, you can expect it to perform exactly like any other game in the genre. Combat uses the tried and true hold a shoulder button to ready your weapon and hit the action button to shoot, but there's a little more to it than what you might be used to. You can hold two weapons at once in Alisa, and you hit the general equivalent to the triangle button on a PS1 controller to switch between them. There's a bit of a delay from pressing the button to actually having Alisa swap them out, so you're not going to be performing DMC tier combinations or anything, but it definitely adds a bit of depth to the typical combat you'd expect from a game like this. For example, if you have a heavy hitter like a Magnum or shotgun equipped, you can expect a pretty long reload time. So instead of wasting that time, you can switch over to another weapon and keep chipping away at whatever you're shooting at. The only downside being, since they gave you an edge with real-time weapon switching, they took away the ability to reload your guns in the inventory screen. A move I was surprised to see and had a noticeable effect on my survival horror muscle memory. But that's not the end of the interesting game design moves. Essentially, Alisa plays like an even 50-50 split between Resident Evil 1 and Dino Crisis 2. Which for some of you in the audience may not make any sense, so let me explain. I'm sure some of you have noticed that when I put enemies down, they drop these clockwork cogs. Well, the game refers to them as tooth wheels, and they serve as an in-game currency that can be put towards ammo, healing items, new weapons, and even dresses that can be swapped out for different stat bonuses or other effects. This whole in-game economy mechanic feels like it wouldn't fit very well into a more traditional survival horror setup, but it really does. Prices are at just the right level so you won't find yourself flush with the things you need, and more items unlock in the shop as you gain more ground in the story. Healing items and ammo in the shop are in a limited quantity, but you can still find them just laying around the environment as well. This whole thing really feels like a balanced addition to what you'd normally see in the genre, and after a few trips back to the save room where the shop can be found, it'll all fall perfectly into place with the more traditional stuff. Like I said before, you get your currency from downed enemies, and keeping that in mind, you will see cleared areas repopulated with harder goons after you make a bit of progress. Now, it doesn't go full Dino Crisis 2 with a never-ending supply of bad guys to rack up points on, which is good because that means it's able to maintain that tight balancing these kind of games really need. Being a survival horror title, you can definitely expect to solve a few puzzles, and I've gotta say, Alisa does a great job of making sure its puzzles walk that thin line between challenging you with their difficulty, but still being able to be solved without halting forward momentum too much. You guys know I always love me a good challenging head scratcher, but it can be really annoying when you have to stop the more fun aspects of the game like combat and exploration and stare at some jumble of shapes or colors and figure out what you're supposed to be doing with them. And speaking of exploration, I think that's another element handled really well here. Part of making a survival horror game is thinking up an interesting location that'll have players wanting to move forward, if only just to see what they'll find next, and Alisa definitely had that effect on me. And sure, a lot of that did come from the general mystery of the story, but I also just wanted to see what type of odd location was waiting for me just behind some locked door or hidden passage. The beginning area you find yourself in seems fairly RE in terms of look and feel, but it won't be too long till you find yourself in a whole-ass 3-ring circus built into the house. Then there's a garden whose vines and plants have all turned to jagged metal and whatever the hell this is. Overall, it's a really nice setting that'll have you wanting to explore and see more of it, but also has an intuitive layout that'll make backtracking a lot more easy to do. And trust me, you will definitely be doing a lot of that. Backtracking is one of those elements that outside of survival horror may seem like more of a downside, but rest assured, here in this genre, it is very much an intended mechanic. One that I think is very much improved by Alisa not including door transition sequences when moving from room to room. Now don't get me wrong, these things most definitely looked great and really added to the atmosphere in the early RE games, but in new titles that don't need to mask any disc-based loading times, I think it's the most acceptable casualty lost to modernity. So just like Tormented Souls, I see Alisa as a perfect representation of the genre. It takes what some might consider to be an antiquated style of game design and brings it fully into the modern day. No concessions made for a wider audience and no dumbing down. To put it simply, this is a real deal survival horror game, and it manages to do all that while also including a very well balanced in-game shop. So not only is it bringing us the kind of experience we fans have been starved of lately, but it also adds a few cool additions that make sure it doesn't feel like some kind of boring callback to a better time. And considering the flat-out misinformation out there as to what specific elements need to be represented for a game to be survival horror, it is really awesome to get a reminder every now and then. Without a doubt, I can guarantee that those of you in the audience who have been looking for a new title in the genre will fall in love with Alisa regardless of what I say next. But for the more skeptical, I do want to air a few grievances. As you guys know, these games can be very strict with the resources they give out, and Alisa is no different. Even though you can buy ammo and healing items when you need them, you'll also essentially have to expend those same items in order to get the tooth wheels needed to make more purchases. So the good news is that level of difficulty balance is still present here despite the inclusion of the shop. It was actually something that really impressed me throughout the playthrough. I was almost never in a position I would call comfortable, always just teeter-tottering on the edge of not having enough of what I need, but I never really ran dry. Which is obviously awesome, so I'm sure you're wondering what's the downside. Well, the bad news is combat can make it a little harder than necessary to conserve those resources. I don't know if it was the pixelated blockiness of the enemies, or me, or the pre-rendered camera angles, but either way I often had issues telling whether or not my shots were lining up. It was a fairly pervasive flaw that was present on any of the screens that didn't have a more zoomed-in view, and it seems like the developers knew about this problem because they included an indicator at the bottom of the screen that'll let you know when you got a clear line of sight. But when using it, I always felt like I was looking at the indicator in those situations and not the actual gameplay. And in Alisa, most enemies are much faster than your typical shambling corpses, so spacing and timing can really make the difference between a clean encounter and one you barely make it out of. Of course, it's not something you'll run into even 30% of the time, but it'll be enough that it's going to get on your nerves. The next problem includes the combat as well, but is a bit harder to explain. So when you aim your weapon, as usual, you can move that aim up or down, but in this game, the up and down buttons don't need to be held to keep looking in that direction. Okay, this is still not making any sense. Here, think of it like this. In the old RE games, pressing a vertical direction would move your aim, but there was always a force returning you to center. So if you let go of a vertical direction, your aim would return to normal. Well, in Alisa, your aim stays exactly where you leave it, which can be good if you're trying to hit an enemy that's both low to the ground and far away. But for the most part, it did a better job of just tripping me up. Personally, I would have preferred the traditional Capcom method over this one, but that might be more because I'm used to it than anything else. But the combat isn't the only place where I ran into issues. I also found something weird regarding the controls. Every once in a while, after holding forward for a bit, I would let go of it and Alisa would just continue moving forward until I pressed another direction. At first, I thought it was my controller, so I switched to a brand new Series X controller and ran into the same problem again. Not sure what could be causing that, but it seems like something that shouldn't be too hard to patch out. On that same note, or maybe even related to it, I would sometimes find the run button to be unresponsive. It's like I would let go of forward and run and then press them both again, but only the forward button would register, so I would start walking when I meant to run. Now, both of these aren't real game-breaking problems, but they can be annoying and sometimes migrate into big headaches in this section where the swinging pendulums can knock you off a platform and deal damage, and of course in combat. And lastly is a section of the game that is far too cryptic for its own good. After clearing a jam in the elevator, you can ride it down to the basement, but eventually you'll run into a dead end, and if you're anything like me, you'll start randomly wandering around hoping to stumble on the next area you're meant to find. Well, I spent a very long time doing that until I finally had to break down and read a guide on the internet, and apparently what I was supposed to do was ride the elevator down to the basement, then back up again, and then ride it one more time to get to the second floor. Now, in the game's defense, I was able to find a file that told me about the general existence of a second floor, but how in the hell was I supposed to luck into that strange series of actions? It seems to be a nearly RNG sort of thing, and the worst part is those events have to take place in that order. I rode that elevator down and up all kinds of times and used the stairs to get back up to the first floor, trying to ride it again, everything, but it just took me to the basement every time I used it. It almost seems like the developer meant for this to be some kind of puzzle maybe. And perhaps it's just me, but I don't think I could have figured this out without help. Now, to be fair, once you know the trick, it stops being a problem. I just wonder how the hell anyone could have figured it out without blind luck. Of course, it is possible I missed something here, so I can't say with certainty that it is solely a fumble on the devs' part, but other than that, this was one hell of a fun time. It took me round about 6 hours in total to finish Alisa, and that's counting a 2-hour playthrough I had to restart when I got a little too low on resources than I would have liked. I'd say that's about long enough an experience that you won't be left wanting more, but not so long that you'll get tired of it by the end. If you ask me, this game is about as close to perfect as you can get. Of course, that's not any kind of real, objective standard of perfection, but instead the kind that sees a modern developer accurately recreating a once-dead style of video game. It does everything fans of the genre would want to see and even adds a little bit for good measure. Of course, it's not without any flaws, but keeping in mind the fact that most of this game was worked on by a single person and that the problems aren't always present, I think that puts it well within acceptable levels of jank. Based on gameplay alone, I can give Alisa a full recommendation. And yeah, sure, a bit of that comes from the fact that you aren't exactly flush with alternatives when it comes to classic survival horror nowadays, but aside from that, it's just a really well put together game. Essentially, it does everything you'd want it to in the exact way you'd expect, but with those small personal flourishes that keep things from feeling too played out. I might be running out of ways to say this, but it's just really refreshing seeing new game devs adopt my favorite school of game design. And it's an even bigger plus that so far these developers have proven themselves to be very competent. You can't really see it right now, but I've got a pretty big smile on my face at the idea of some kind of a survival horror resurrection. Hey, it could happen.
Hey, come over here. Open this door. You're under arrest.
Now believe me when I say it is more than enough for a developer to just bring this style of game back into the market, but it is even cooler when they do it in a low-poly PS1 looking kind of way. 3D models in Alisa are jagged and pixelated depending on how far you are from the camera and actually do a great job of mirroring the look of early RE games being upscaled to modern resolutions. And speaking of which, this game can run at 480p, which is perfect for a CRT monitor over VGA. Very nice touch. It looks like Casper Crows really knew his shit in terms of the game's presentation. I mean, he even had the pre-rendered cutscenes show signs of old-style disc-based compression with artifacts and color banding. So essentially what I'm saying is, this guy, instead of making all of his assets as high-res as they would be viewed on a modern monitor, had them all rendered out at lower resolutions and the game upscales them for you. As a guy who's obsessed with scaling old 32-bit games, this is something that pleases me to no end, but even I can admit this look might scare off a few potential players. It sucks to admit, but there are actually people out there who didn't grow up with this look and therefore aren't cultured enough to know it's objectively the best. If you do find yourself a little deterred by that, trust me, it'll lose that weird appeal pretty early on, and maybe after 20 minutes you'll stop noticing how different it looks from most games and it'll all just kind of flow. Aside from the general low poly look though, there's a lot to talk about here. The first section of the game is set in a small village, and at first I was really hyped on the idea of spending most of my time in a more regular, grounded kind of location. I can't really say why, but I've always enjoyed games that have fantasy situations going down in more realistic settings, but after Alisa woke up in the dollhouse, I found the more fantastical setting to be just as appealing. Each major area has its own visual style that helps set it apart from where you just were, and there's always some kind of theme they stick to. The monsters that chase you around the mansion can vary from pretty regular looking to mildly disturbing, and I think the low poly pixelated style helps add to that. Of course, the pre-rendered backdrops were a huge bonus for me, and I'm happy to say these things not only look good on their own, but also stay true to the PS1 assets they're imitating. It looks to me like these backgrounds were modeled in high-res 3D, then compressed and resized down to something more like 240 or 480p. The compression they used seems very accurate, with really similar color depth reduction that you would see in REs 1 through 3. Obviously, the look here is a little more clean than analog video output from a console in the 90s, but if anything, this whole game looks like it could have been a mod for RE1's SourceNext PC release. On a much smaller but semi-important note, menus and the inventory screen all look really good, and the text is perfectly legible while still keeping that sharp pixel look, which isn't something that's always easily achieved. On a more surprising note, I actually really got into the idea of changing out Alisa's dresses during the game, and I guess kudos to the developer for not including any kind of paid DLC in this manner. God knows the last thing we need in these indie games is pre-order bonuses and DLC costumes. Getting back on track though, when you're looking at the same 3D model for the entire game, it can be a little boring. Being able to swap out clothes is a nice touch, and those outfits giving you stat bonuses is just icing on the cake. Another thing that really took me by surprise was the game's soundtrack. Instead of mimicking the sound you'd likely get from a PS1, they seem to be targeting an old PC MIDI sort of sound. Actually, it sounded a lot like what you'd hear in the first two Alone in the Dark games. So in that sense, the MIDI here may be a little simpler in instrumentation, but the music itself is anything but. Very solid tracks that make the backtracking you'll have to do way more fun. In fact, the only song I really had an issue with was the one that plays in the circus area. That track got on my nerves pretty quick, and I had to listen to it a lot throughout my playthrough. And speaking of sound, I had no idea till I beat the game that YouTube's own Sphere Hunter did the voice acting for one of the boss characters. How cool is that? For people like us, actually getting to appear in a survival horror game is like the ultimate achievement, so big congrats, Susie.
Who dares enter my garden?
Overall, I'd say Alisa looks, plays, and sounds enough like a PS1 game that it might as well be one. And that's not to say you should play this simply because of its novelty. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's awesome being able to relive my preteen years like this, but on top of that, it's just a really well-made video game. Sure, it gets automatic points for targeting the kind of experience I look for, but what impressed me was that they were able to pull it all off so accurately. A lot of times, these type of throwback games can feel more like gimmicks wearing the clothes of a serious entry in the genre, sort of like the similarities are only skin deep, surface level. But it seems clear to me these people were genuinely fans of these games, and they really approached this with authenticity at the top of their priority list. And the result is just that. Alisa is incredibly fun, and it stays true to a style of game that if you're subbed to this channel, you'll probably already love. Listen guys, I'm willing to admit that I'm starting to get the feeling I had the modern survival horror scene judged all kinds of wrong, so expect to see more videos of these indie horror titles on the channel in the future. I'm really looking forward to diving further into this rabbit hole, but to do that, I'm gonna have to get out of here. So until next time, I'm Jared. And this is Avalanche Reviews. Hey, thanks for watching, guys. I'm really glad you talked me into trying this one out because it ended up being a high point in the year for me. If you enjoy modern survival horror titles, I'll have some videos you'll probably get into here on screen, and if you want to bankroll more videos like this, I'll link my Patreon. Of course, becoming a YouTube channel member will accomplish that same goal, but if you're unable to support financially, which is totally understandable, a quick like and maybe a comment will go just as far. Thanks for being so damn supportive, guys, and here's hoping each one of you has an awesome day and plays some killer survival horror games.